Hi, I'm Richard Karn, and you may have seen me on TV talking about the world's #1 expandable garden hose. Well, the brand new Pocket Hose Copperhead with Pocket Pivot is here, and it's a total game changer. Old-fashioned hoses get kinks and creases at the spigot, but the Copperhead's Pocket Pivot swivels 360 degrees for full water flow and freedom to water with ease all around your home. When you're all done, this rust-proof anti-burst hose shrinks back down to pocket size for effortless handling and tidy storage. Plus, your super light and ultra-durable Pocket Hose Copperhead is backed with a 10-year warranty. What could be better than that? I'll tell you what, an exciting radio-exclusive offer just for you. For a limited time, you can get a free Pocket Pivot and their 10-pattern sprayer with the purchase of any size Copperhead hose. Just text WATER to 64,000. That's WATER to 64,000 for your 2 free gifts with purchase. WATER to 64,000.
By texting 64,000, you agree to receive recurring automated marketing messages from Pocket Hose. Message and data rates may apply. No purchase required. Terms apply. Available at pockethose.com/terms.
China has admitted 2 cyber attacks against America already and for quite some time. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, that is a fair statement. The Chinese regime decided that the way they were going to get to the top of the food chain was by essentially bypassing the heavy lift of research and development.
This isn't some conspiracy theory. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Dr. Phil podcast. I think you're going to learn some things today. Maybe they will be unsettling, maybe they won't. I'll let you decide. If you have not followed, subscribed, and shared, I would appreciate you doing so. Just click the buttons and you know all the things to do. My guest today is Mike Baker. I bet you know him. You've probably seen him. You've certainly heard him speak. He's a man whose career and insights really read like a real-world thriller. Mike has spent 2 decades as a covert operative with the CIA's Operation Directorate tackling counterterrorism, and that includes counter-narcotics, paramilitary operations, and more. I'm talking about in the shadowy corners of the globe. And after leaving the CIA, he founded the Portman Square Group. This is a global intelligence and security firm which has become a cornerstone in risk mitigation and geopolitical analysis. Mike's also a really accomplished author. In his book, Company Rules, Everything I Know About Business I Learned from the CIA really offers a unique perspective on applying intelligence principles to the business world. Also, quite interestingly, he's the host of the President's Daily Brief podcast. And if you want to know what's going on in the world, you want to know what Trump's up to, and you can't call and talk to him, you want to listen to this. And you can listen to it every morning. Truly a must listen for anyone wanting to stay informed on the most pressing issues of the day, certainly the ones that the president is juggling. So Mike, welcome. I appreciate you being here.
Thank you very much, Dr. Phil. And that may be the finest introduction I've ever had in my life. So I appreciate it very much.
Well, you've accomplished a lot, and it takes a while to describe it, and I didn't get into everything, which we will as we go along. I want to start out talking about China because, you know, right now with the tariffs and with Taiwan and everything going on, we've seen a lot in the headlines recently about China and some of the trade wars, and we've heard a lot about military-age men coming across the border into America. I want to hear your thoughts and insights on China because, according to you and others, China has admitted 2 cyber attacks against America already and for quite some time. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, that is a fair statement. They let slip during a meeting overseas, which were several fairly high-ranking U.S. officials, the notion that they were behind a number of cyber attacks and various forms of cyber shenanigans over the years. It's a kind of a statement of the obvious in a sense. And I think whenever you talk about China, the Chinese regime, we're not talking about the people, the population. They're great. The history, the culture. There's so many fascinating and good aspects of China as a country. But we're talking about the regime led by Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party and their intel apparatus. A couple of things that are really important to remember with them is that they play the long game. They look at the world and they look at history and they look at time, the movement of time differently than we do, or the West does. And by that, they really do have a long vision. Right? We tend to get, I think, in the U.S., and if you just drill down and narrow it down to our operations, our intelligence operations, we tend to have ADHD, right? We're always chasing the next, shiny tinfoil ball like a raccoon. And so our time frame tends to be very condensed. The Chinese look at it differently, right? They have a much longer view, more patience in what they do, and that includes their intelligence operations, which leads me to the other part that's always important to keep in mind is that decades ago, the Chinese regime decided that the way they were going to get to the top of the food chain was by essentially bypassing the heavy lift of research and development, right? All that work. And they were just going to hoover up everything they could get their hands on, and not just from the US, but from the West in general, to jumpstart and to bypass the processes of research and development, all the work and the costs that go into that. And that's what they've been doing. And, whether you're talking about putting a Intel operative into the US as a undergrad student who then his only job is to get good grades and then go to grad school. And then their only job is to get a good job after that and then find another one. And eventually you got 20 or 30 years down the road and they're a producing Intel asset, because now maybe they're sitting inside of Corning or IBM or SAIC or what, name any company that they may find of interest. And so their ability over the years, through a variety of means, to engage in the theft of intellectual property, research and development, economic intelligence, it has really jump-started their efforts. And it has cost the U.S. and the West an incalculable amount of money, a lost opportunity, jobs, a variety of other things. And we're just now getting our heads around that notion, right? The Intel community, I think, has known it for quite some time, but it's become more of a public understanding just over the past few years.
Let's talk about this for a second, because we hear about this, we watch TV series like The Americans. We look at that like it's some kind of spy fiction. But what you're saying is this isn't some conspiracy theory, that they are playing the long game. They do get people insinuated into American society, into the fabric of society, and they adapt. They look like, act like, feel like, integrate into society, but they never lose sight of the fact that they're here to gather information, and it may be military information, it may be corporate intelligence or whatever, and they're constantly feeding that back to China, which is kind of like the generic drug companies do. They don't spend hundreds of millions of dollars on R&D. They wait until somebody like Eli Lilly or whatever does it, and then they just come in and become the generic, and the first generic in the water gets 40% of the business, but they have no R&D cost in it, and that's what China's doing. They're sending people over here, getting all of our work and taking it back over there. That's really happening, and it's going on right now as you and I are speaking.
Yes. Look, the FBI, the Bureau, they're busy almost every week opening up a new counterintelligence case related to the Chinese regime, to the PLA and the Intel apparatus. And they do it through a variety of means, right? So it's not just, as you mentioned, the Americans, which was based on an actual Russian situation on the East Coast a few years back, where we had a cell of essentially sleeper assets who their job was to assimilate into the U.S. lifestyle and develop relationships. And maybe you'll meet somebody. Maybe you're standing on the sidelines of your kid's soccer game on a Saturday, and you find yourself talking to somebody who works for an interesting financial institution or works at a manufacturing plant producing aircraft parts. It doesn't matter, because all information may at some point be of benefit. So that was their job. These Russians that were there on the East Coast, they just literally become part of the fabric of society, see who you meet, and see about developing that, and then hand them over to someone who is a little bit further down the line within that Intel organization to then start to develop and start looking for access points, start looking for weaknesses, start looking for points of leverage. And it could be something very simple. The Chinese regime does the same thing, and they also do a variety of other efforts. A lot of information they hoover up just through academic institutions, right? And whether it's attending conferences, developing relationships with visiting professors, again, maybe I, find out that my son, I'm living in the States and my son is going to school with someone who works at a company of interest. Next thing you know, I'm trying to figure out, well, how can I get them on side? How do I start to develop a relationship with them? A lot of times the Chinese regime is looking for first or second generation Chinese Americans, and they play off of that historical relationship, that connection back to China, to try to get them on side. And whether they're unwitting or whether they eventually become witting assets or cooperative contacts, doesn't matter. The Chinese, again, they play the long game. They have patience. They're willing to invest a lot of time and resource into this. And all information potentially is of interest to them. They've got the motivation and the resources to grab it all and then sift through and see what could benefit one of their pseudo-state companies, perhaps.
This episode is brought to you by Masa chips. For decades, chips were fried in tallow until big corporations switched to cheap seed oils. Now, seed oils make up 20% of the average American's daily calories, linked to inflammation and metabolic issues. Masa is bringing back the good stuff with 3 simple ingredients: organic nixtamalized corn, sea salt, and 100% grass-fed beef tallow. No seed oils, no junk, just a crunchy, sturdy chip that won't break in your guac. Masa Chips is beloved by tens of thousands of customers and has been endorsed by industry-leading health and nutrition experts like Ben Greenfield and Gary Brecka. Ready to give Masa a try? Go to masachips.com/merit and use code MERIT for 25% off your first order. That's masachips.com/merit and code MERIT for 25% off your first order. I've written, I think, 11 books, 10, 11 books or something, and I'll have a book that's selling millions of copies, and so my publisher or agent will get a note from China that, hey, we love this best-selling book, so we want to publish it here, and they'll offer $5,000 for the rights to publish a book that's selling millions of copies. And my publisher and agent will say, take it. I say, what do you mean, take it? That's nothing. And they'll say, they're going to publish it anyway. What are you going to do? Sue China and China? They have no respect for IP at all. You can't sue China and China. You might as well take the $5,000 because they're going to publish it anyway and probably already are. They truly do just grab what they want and just use it and do so with impunity. I guess there's not much you can do about it.
There's not much you can do about it in the sense that the way that we perceive it, there's not really a rule of law in China. Right. So, defending your intellectual property, defending your rights, it's nowhere near the way that we understand it to be in the US or the UK or, out in the West. I remember a conversation one time with a pharmaceutical company, and they had called us in, they called some, my company and said, look, how do we're opening up a manufacturing facility in China. And we want to start building the protocols to protect our intellectual property. They're a very good company, very big company, lots of overseas experience. So I was a little bit stunned at that concept. And so I had to say, look, you're not going to. You have to accept that whatever you do over there is going to end up with them, right? Whether it's code, whether it's some form of IP, it's going to be with them before too long, because that's just the way it is. So there's only so much that you can do to prevent. But companies in the West have always been willing to put up with that because the Chinese market, selling into the Chinese market, has been the holy grail for decades.
Yeah, because there's so many. It's such a big market. Mm-hmm. Let me ask you this. I work a lot with Tom Homan with Homeland Security and ICE, and they tell me that in the last few years, we've had as many as 30,000 Chinese come across the border, most of them down around San Diego, and that an uncomfortable number are military-age men. And they tell me that they are in shape, flat-bellied, all have the same kind of boots on, all have the same kind of backpacks on, and they're coming across the border. How do they get here? And we don't know where they are. Who are these people? Why are they here?
Yeah, it's interesting. The human trafficking industry and the routes that are taken, it's very organized. It's very established. It is a, think of it as a corporation, basically. I mean, there's not just one, but there's a number of them out there engaged in that sector of human trafficking, of moving humans to various parts of the world. It's not unlike the gray arms market. People imagine that to be, dodgy and shady, and, it exists in, in this sort of murky world. And it's also a very organized, very buttoned up business, right? But with the Chinese individuals coming across the border, a lot of them through the San Diego sector, look, are a number of them out there just looking for a better life, just looking to try to find, a job and do it? Of course there are, right? But you would have to be incredibly naive or just willfully partisan to believe that there aren't some that are being sent across to take advantage of that at the time, the chaos of that open border, essentially, to make their way over. And it doesn't take a lot. If you've got, say, the number you cited, 30,000, but doesn't take 30,000 of them to create a national security concern. You could be talking about a dozen or 2 dozen, right, that would do that, because if you only have those few, but they're willing assets of, let's say, the PLA intel apparatus, and their job is to be on the ground and recce or reconnaissance sites that are of interest, infrastructure sites, whatever it may be, and just to provide information, right? Gather information. Maybe that's all it is. People roll their eyes sometimes when you talk about things like this. They go, you're just being, as you pointed out, a conspiracy theorist, right? You're paranoid. Well, again, if you imagine that the Chinese regime, which has been so aggressive and interested in gathering information on the U.S. and others over the years, didn't look at the chaos in the U.S. southern border during the previous administration and think to themselves, let's take advantage of this, just like a well-resourced terrorist organization would, right? Or the cartels where they're looking for other opportunities, then I can't help you, because someone with that mindset doesn't appear to be living on the same planet.
Is there any theory under which we don't believe that China hasn't mapped out our energy grid?
So when you talk about the Chinese regime, no, they've been very active over the years, poking and prodding at our infrastructure, at the U.S. infrastructure. And again, they're equal opportunity, right? They're doing this to a lot of countries out in the West. And what they're doing is they're putting together they've already put together a playbook for the next, however you want to call it, the next big global conflict, right? Because at that point, they will have already identified weaknesses in our power grids and our water treatment facilities and transportation hubs, the way that cash moves, the way that fuel moves. They will have identified all the important things on the infrastructure in the U.S. as an example, because if there is, God forbid, knock on wood, whatever you do, if there is that next big global conflict, and say, it's the West against the Chinese, hopefully that never happens, but you got to game out all the scenarios, then the idea will be to bring the pain to the homeland as quickly as possible and change that mindset of the population. And if you shut down power and you shut down the ability to move food, if you shut down running water, safe water, if you shut down the ability to get pharmaceuticals or cash, whatever it may be, on the home front, then the impact is devastating, right? Because people don't have a high tolerance for pain, basically, I don't think, the average person. And that will dictate the way that the government will deal with that conflict. So everybody, I'm not saying, look, the U.S. does the same thing. We better hope the U.S. does it, better than anybody else. But in other countries in the West do the same thing if they've got the resources. They're all out there putting together these playbooks to understand how to do that, right? If you take down the satellite systems and suddenly people don't have GPS, God forbid they don't have TikTok, then again you're changing the mindset of the population that you're fighting against, and that's a powerful thing.
Isn't this exactly the reason that the Portman Square Group is in business? And isn't this exactly the reason you better be in business? Because if they come in and shut down the banking industry, if they come in and shut down the transportation industry, if this is under attack and there are those organizations that have the cybersecurity, that have the readiness that the Portman Square group brings, they're going to be hardened. They're going to be having backup plans, alternative plans. They're going to have a readiness that maybe a sleepy government and a snail-paced Congress hasn't done. That, and I've always said, you need something done, let the private sector work it out. The government's not going to work it out. We'll work it out in the private sector. Isn't that exactly why you're in business?
Well, it is. Yeah. I mean, you mentioned at the very beginning, and I appreciate it very much. It's the idea of risk mitigation, right? Be proactive. And whether you're talking about, collecting intelligence, collecting information for your business. Look, if you run a multinational corporation, it's not rocket science. If your information, if your understanding of a market or your understanding of your competitors is just that much better, right? Then your success is going to be this much, right? It's fairly simple calculation. And the same is true with sort of the concept of security services. And nowadays, of course, when you talk security, you're almost always talking about cyber. Now, it's a very difficult realm. And there's a lot of companies out there that are working on this. We're certainly not the only ones, but there are groups out there, state groups such as the Chinese regime, the Iranians, North Koreans, the Russians, and also pseudo-state groups, anarchist groups. There's a variety of criminal organizations, and they're all looking to create havoc out there in cyberspace. If you're running a company or a corporation and you don't have this buttoned up, or you're not focused on it, you haven't identified your key information and what you need to protect, and then you haven't identified the best ways to protect it, and tried to make yourself as resilient, you can't minimize the risk down to zero. But you can certainly give it a really good effort to try to get as close to zero as possible. The other side, the hostile side, whoever the perpetrator may be, they're very aggressive and they're very oftentimes well-resourced. It's tough. They're always looking for the next, the next opportunity, the next weakness, the next, vulnerable attack point. Yeah, and you're right. The government has gotten better. They were slow getting out of the gate and understanding the importance of this. But as an example, the FBI, they've been working hard over the past few years to develop a better relationship with the commercial sector, to get out there and help them understand where the threats are coming from, and to help them reverse engineer attacks that have happened so that they can prevent the future ones. And so I give the FBI a lot of credit because they have understood the importance of that dialogue between the commercial sector and the government, and what the capabilities of the government can be to help protect the commercial side.
I assume that America is doing the same thing. I assume that U.S. intelligence is mapping out the infrastructure, the energy grid, the cyber status of those that we suspect would do us harm or wish us ill. I assume that we're looking at Korea and China and Russia and others that would try to create chaos in the United States. I assume we're doing the same thing that we suspect them of doing.
Yes, and again, the same people out there that view this as a community of nations, and if we didn't do something like that, then everybody else would stop doing it. They tend to roll their eyes and say, "Well, but the U.S. does it too." Well, you better hope that we do. And we do. Look, I'm subjective. This is probably exactly what people would think I'm going to say, but I think the U.S. has the finest intel organization, certainly with the CIA. Look, I'm also partial to the UK's agencies. I think 5 and 6 in the UK are extremely good, very good. I think we, in the U.S. And NSA and some others are the benchmark in this. And yes, we have been doing that because it's not just for defensive purposes. It's for that potential scenario down the road. And you better hope, as a citizen of the country that you live in, that your country is prepared for a potential problem. Because just like with another pandemic, we'll have another pandemic. Yes, we'll have another conflict. It's just, unfortunately, it appears to be human nature.
We are in the midst of a brutal allergy season. According to experts, it is longer and more severe than in years past. For many of us, that means sleepless nights, tossing, turning, and sneezing, and the dreaded postnasal drip. That's not even half of it. But there is a solution: Samrosa night syrups. It's effective. Try it and get your best night's sleep. If you watched my town hall with RFK Jr., then you know Samrosa is sponsoring Merit TV's Make America Healthy Again campaign. That's because Samrosa contains no dyes, synthetic colors, or artificial flavors, and no high fructose corn syrup. Just a base of nutrient-rich honey and 7 organic herbs and a small dose of antihistamine that will have you sleeping like a baby. Go to Samrosa.com and use code MERIT for 25% off your first order. Wake up rested and invigorated. Again, go to Samrosa.com and use code MERIT for 25% off your first order. What is our level of preparedness, would you say? Are we poorly prepared, fairly prepared, well prepared? Where would you put the United States?
Yeah, I'd say we're, when you talk about the infrastructure and the hardening of the infrastructure against attacks, I'd say we're okay, but there are some soft targets out there. Look, the power grid, just as an example, right? We've got 3 grids, basically, the East, the West, and Texas. And those grids were built. The power structure was built. Think about it like a patchwork quilt, right? It was cobbled together over years. And it certainly was never built with the idea that it's got to withstand a terrorist attack. That was not top of mind in the 1940s as we were building out a power grid. And certainly not that it could withstand a cyber attack. So there have been efforts. It's Washington, D.C., so efforts coming out of Congress tend to always be slow. There have been some efforts. It is a very costly enterprise to try to improve and harden security on something like a power grid. But there's awareness, and that's a good place to be, right? I just say that there are a lot of potential targets out there, and there are a number of entities looking to identify those that are the weakest. So, yeah. The work's cut out for us. It doesn't sound like a very cheery assessment, does it?
No, but it's a motivational assessment. I know just a few years ago, we had an extremely harsh winter in North Texas, and the reports were we were within minutes of the grid going down, and it would have taken, they said, months and months to get it back up through just poor management of the real central power stations and all. And that was without an attack. That was just from demand. And I just wonder if we get in a situation like that, somebody comes by with a .22 rifle on the highway. I mean, it was. I think you're given a pretty rosy assessment from what I understand of the Texas grid. I don't know about the East and West, but I appreciate the encouragement, but I wonder if we're more vulnerable than we think.
You're absolutely right. We're definitely more vulnerable than we think, than certainly the average citizen thinks. That is absolutely true.
I've put together a very fact-based map I'd like you to take a look at and comment on, because this is a map of where China has come in and purchased, quote, farmland. There's an overlay. The red is where they've purchased farmland, and this is a national map, so you can imagine how many thousands and thousands of acres that red represents. And then I've got an overlay of the military installations that they've decided to purchase this farmland around in many cases. And some of these are really strategic military installations. How do you feel about the Chinese coming in and buying up all of this land? We can't do that in China, but they come in and buy all of this, particularly around our strategic military installations. And some of them have like wind farms. And so they've got these big towers up, but they don't have any propellers on them. I mean, we've got videos.
Which should be a clue. Yeah, that should be a clue.
Yeah, there's a clue. They've got cameras on them, not propellers up there, and we're allowing it to happen. I had a guy on, a wonderful guy, that actually, he was a black farmer, and at one time in his life, his great-grandfather had sharecropped that land. Then they were able to hang on to it, and he now owns that and has added to it. And he said they have paid so much for the farmland around his land and driven the prices up so high that he may now lose his land because he can't afford to pay the taxes on it because they've driven the prices up so high by coming in and paying whatever they had to get the land.
Yeah, there is no coincidence. That map's a really good one. There's no coincidence, between the location of land that's purchased and the location of sensitive U.S. facilities. Look, I mean, Canada is by far the largest landowner, foreign landowner in the U.S., and you could do a similar map, and despite the vast amount of land that the Canadian purchasers own, it wouldn't correlate to sensitive facilities the way that this, in relative terms, small amount of purchases correlate to sensitive facilities. And it's, oftentimes it's just because, look, they roll in through a seemingly innocuous entity, a commercial enterprise, to say, we'd like to set up a soybean factory here. And, the town council looks at it and goes, great. Yeah, sure. We'll sell you at this very attractive price. That's terrific news. And there's no due diligence done, really, to say the least. Now, the awareness has changed, and that's a good thing. But look, for years, as an aside, not just from the land purchases, but the Chinese regime was in the business of selling ridiculously inexpensive, again, it's all relative, but inexpensive telecoms gear to regional carriers out in much of the same area where a lot in the West, certainly, the sensitive facilities are. So, and why would they doing that? Why would they sell equipment under, actual, profitable cost to these U.S. regional telecoms carriers? Well, it's because they wanted their gear up on these towers, right? And it's, they can manipulate that gear to do whatever they want. So if they want to suddenly turn on a camera and view off in the distance, look, we're talking about very, sophisticated equipment, view off in the distance an air base and just, make note of traffic coming in and out. It's like the Chinese control of the ports, down in the Panama Canal, right? Just having intelligence about what U.S. ships, particularly military vessels, are coming and going, that's good intel. Right? People always say, well, it's not, it doesn't appear to be a national security secret, but, information, a lot of information has value that you don't necessarily see when you first look at it. So, and the Chinese regime, again, their intel apparatus is very good at just hoovering it all up. So, yeah, I look at this map, and the only upside to it, I believe, is that there's much more awareness now within the U.S. government. So foreign purchases are being scrutinized much more carefully than they were, and that's a good thing.
Yeah, it's a good thing. One of the things you talk about is what keeps the intelligence community up at night. What is the biggest concern? I know that we're not as worried about an actual invasion on our shores so much as we are the cyber. Is it the cyber disruption that keeps you guys up at night?
Yeah, it is. I think and that surprises a lot of people. Look, I mean, the top 4 or 5 categories haven't really changed much over the decades. It's interesting because you say, okay, well, what have been the top concerns? Well, it's China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. People always imagine terrorism is up there, and it is, but it's not in those top 4 or 5. But infrastructure and the weakness of infrastructure and the vulnerability of U.S. infrastructure. Yes, that keeps people up at night because they also understand if you're in the intel community or you're over in the Pentagon, and depending on what area you're involved in, you're pretty aware of just how aggressive that poking and prodding of our infrastructure is, right? Just kind of looking for ways in, not necessarily to take something down, but they're looking for these points of attack for possible future use. And you're aware of that, right? I mean, it's been said that, look, if the average citizen knew just how often our infrastructure was poked and prodded for that reason, people wouldn't sleep particularly well at night. It sounds like I'm telling people to get prepared for something horrible. Hopefully that doesn't happen. I'm just saying you got to be pragmatic and understand the world that you live in.
Is there, clearly you're not telling everybody to go dig a bunker in their backyard and
No.
Start stockpiling beans and rice and water, but it does make sense to have some degree of readiness if we get a huge cyber attack where you can't move money around, where you don't have communications, where you don't have all of the technology that we do now. Is it paranoid to have a degree of readiness beyond what we have now? Because for most people, it's zero.
If you're building a condo inside of a bunker, then yeah, maybe it's paranoid. But I think it's just common sense to be somewhat realistic and somewhat prepared. I mean, just for the logical things. It could be a natural disaster. It could be the fires, right, in California. It could be, as you mentioned, the grid goes down in Texas because it's a weather crisis. But just be, somewhat aware that you should have the basics. And it's not rocket science. I think most people can figure out what they should have, a week or 2 weeks of readily available food, some water supply, have a little cash on hand, have a communications plan. People tend to overlook that. But, if something were to happen, right, and your kids are at school, or one of your parents is in a assisted living facility, what are you going to do? How do you communicate with them? Do you have a rally point? How do you get together? There's little things you can do. Do you have the ability to keep the car gassed up? Right? Fine. Just do some basics. You don't have to go overboard, but there's a reason to be somewhat prepared. And it could just, again, be as pedestrian as a natural disaster or, some sort of weather incident.
I see things where people get in weather in the winter, they run out of gas on the highway because they don't keep their gas tanks above half. They don't keep food that is storable and that sort of thing. And you're just saying be commonsensical here, because if we have an energy grid go down, if we do have a cyber attack that breaks down our money exchange system or whatever, you're going to wish that you had something.
Right. And pharmaceuticals are important too. Think about your pharmaceuticals, right? If you've got special medications you need for your kids or for yourself or for parents or whatever, just look at that and go, okay, well, is there a way that I can, and there are a handful of companies out there that specialize in making sure that you will have necessary medications on hand. It's all those little things combined, and you know what, it gives you a little peace of mind, and that's a good thing, because you don't know, right? Nobody can predict what's going to happen. Nobody predicted the last pandemic, and then as it turns out, the hot commodity was toilet paper. Who knew?
Yeah, who knew? Is it true that, and I've had experts say this, and it's been a year or two ago, that over 90% of the fundamental ingredients that make up most of our prescription medications do come out of China? And if they stop providing those, these medications that are broadly used, I'm not talking about highly sophisticated medication, I'm talking about core antibiotics and things like that, not the medications, the finished medications themselves, but those core ingredients that make up those finished products come out of China. If they stop shipping those things out, we could be in a real pickle.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And look, and we saw that during the pandemic, right? And it's not just China; it's India as well. And that's a national security issue, right? That we've outsourced key pharmaceutical output overseas, and particularly, with a country where we acknowledge that we've got some fairly difficult tensions right now. So, it's something that when they talk about onshoring, bringing manufacturing production back to the U.S., I always think, that's a great idea. Let's start with pharmaceuticals, right? Because I tell you what, if we have a global conflict, people are going to want their lorazepam or their Xanax or whatever. They're going to be very disappointed if they find out they can't get it.
Yeah, that just seems like a vulnerability that you don't think about every day, but that's something we could be in real trouble if we get into a stalemate of some sort. You talk about the time that you were at the CIA, and you said, I was there at a terrific time in terms of the variety of operations we were engaged in, and they gave us a lot of responsibility. And at that time, we still had a real risk appetite, and it's kind of changed a bit now. How has it changed?
Look, there was always a risk versus gain calculation at the agency, right? When I was there, even before then, you always have these conversations. There then came a period of time where the agency was just getting its backside kicked constantly by Capitol Hill. And when that happens, say, let's look at the global war on terror and the interrogation program, right? When that happens, you basically, maybe without intention, you develop a level of management that just says, I don't want this trouble, right? I don't need this. So a good watch is when nothing bad happens on my watch. And in the intel world and operational world, that means typically you're not doing much, right? Because there's always potential for blowback. You just have to assess what that could be and whether the potential gain is worth it, right? And that's an important calculation. You have to know your risk appetite. I'm just saying that I believe over the years the risk appetite has gone down because the agency has been kicked around so much. Sometimes fine, sometimes rightly so, but that has an impact on an organization's risk appetite. And the CIA, if nothing else, is a risk-taking organization. And if you don't want it to engage in risk-taking, then you might as well shut it down and then just sit around and hope for the best and hope that those people that think we live in a peaceful, community of nations are right. But I think we'll find out the opposite.
Well, I think we're already finding out the opposite, aren't we?
Yeah.
Everything that you talk about in this book, and it did not seem to me like a stretch at all. You say you're taking everything you learned in the intelligence community and applying it to business. In fact, your subtitle, it's Company Rules, or Everything I Know About Business I Learned from the CIA. And people can say, well, that's a stretch. How do you go from that one world to the corporate world? That didn't seem like a stretch to me at all. In fact, that seemed like such a common sense move and not at all a big jump. In fact, you talk about some of the lessons included. Number one that I pulled out of it was define your mission. You say if you're going to be in business, you got to start out. You better know where you're going when you start. Define your mission. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, that is really critical. Whether you're a new recruit to the agency or whether you've just joined a company, right? And if you're the CEO of that company or you're running that business, you need to define the mission, because you can't assume that people understand what your mission is. And your mission shouldn't be, if you're running a business, it shouldn't be, well, our mission is to make money, right? No, we've got to drill down a little bit deeper than that. So maybe your mission is to produce the finest strategic intelligence and risk mitigation work product available. Okay, fine. Now you're getting somewhere. With the agency, to me, the surprise was I joined when I was recruited into the operations directorate, and we spent a great deal of time at the outset, right, being talked to about what the agency is, what fundamentally it does, why it exists, what its purpose is, what its mission is, right? And that was very important because it gets everyone on the same sheet of music. And so I can't emphasize that enough. You've got to start there. With any new hire, with any new recruit, they have to understand the core mission of the organization that they're joining.
It seems like an unguided missile without that, both in business and in the intelligence world. And one of the things that jumped out at me was know your risk appetite. And in business, talk about that from a business perspective, because you said some really insightful things about that.
As an example, I think the reason why I became so focused on that was because of the nature of the business that I started when I got out of the organization, right? We deal with a lot of corporations on some sensitive issues, right? And so, we're collecting information on their behalf, strategic intelligence, or it could be just very pedestrian. It could be due diligence information ahead of a joint venture or a purchase. But you have to be very clear with those companies about, as an example, this is just one of many examples, but as an example of what they can and can't have. If you're a company and you're engaged in it's a multinational, so you're working overseas, you have to understand what the rules are in each jurisdiction that you're operating in, right? Because you can't just send a company like ours out and say, I need this intelligence, I need this information, go get it, right? It's incumbent upon us as a business that's in the collection business to say, okay, well, here's what you can have and what you can't have. Here's what's allowed in this jurisdiction and here's what's not allowed. Because otherwise you're going to run afoul. And the next thing you know, that company is on the front pages of a newspaper somewhere, because, either their employees were engaged in it. I mean, maybe you send out a sales team. If you're a company, you send out a sales team to try to pick up a contract, and you're you're working against competitors, foreign competitors who have no problems putting money under the table to try to win that contract. And there are a lot of companies out there that are happy to do that. And a lot of recipients on the other side happy to take that money and then award the contract. But in the U.S., we've got some very serious rules. People hear that and they go, "Oh, sure we do." They do, right? Yeah. The Foreign Corrupt Practices Act it will shut a company down. So you have to understand, and you have to then define that, just like you define the mission to your people. You have to define what the risk appetite is to your people so they don't step outside of that.
I've done a lot of research on winners, champions, success stories. I've studied it since I was very young and continued it all through my life. Empirical studies, academic studies, case studies. And one of the things that I learned is that winners deal with the truth, and they deal with it right now. They don't romance themselves. They don't kid themselves. They don't deal in denial. And that was one of the things you talked about, is immediately admit your mistakes. You talk about the fact that if something's going wrong, deal with it right now. It's not going to get better with time.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that one up. When I was young, and as we talked about, the CIA, one of the things that it does that I think is so admirable is they give young people, in the operations side anyway, a great deal of responsibility. And so I remember showing up on site in a country, and it was the deputy chief there at the time who, first things he said to me as we were having a quick briefing, I was going to be working outside of that area, but he said, if something goes wrong, if something gets screwed up, if you make a mistake, tell me immediately and we'll sort it out. We'll get it. We'll figure it out. And look, in operations, something at some point is going to go wrong, right? Not everything's going to go your way. And so sure enough, we had something go south, and first thing I did was reach out, got a hold of the individual, said, "Here's what happened. We got a goat rope." And they sorted it out. And that's important. You can't tell your people, you can't tell your staff, you can't tell whoever's working for you that admit your mistake, and then you can't drop the hammer, right? You can't say admit your mistake and then fire them. I mean, unless it's enormously egregious, right? But if they've made a mistake and you think we can recover from that, and they're not going to do it again, don't tolerate repeated mistakes. But you've got to, as a manager, as a leader, you've got to demonstrate your ability to follow through, right, and sort it out. And they did. And I never forgot that. So I've told people that all the time. The worst thing you can do in intelligence, in the operations world, is to have somebody who covers up a mistake, covers up a problem, because now they're vulnerable. Now they got a weakness, and hostile actors, whether it's another intel service working against you or whomever, they're gonna potentially find that. And human nature being what it is, somebody may not want to then admit that mistake, and they're going to find themselves in a world of hurt, because now suddenly they're controllable by that hostile organization.
See, what you're talking about is, from a psychological perspective, this all comes down to motivation, and you're demonstrating something that we are losing in this country, in my opinion, or have lost in this country, which is the skill of critical thinking, where you just sit down and you're honest and you critically analyze something. I have people that drive themselves crazy sometimes playing the what if game. Oh my God, what if this happens? Oh my God, what if that happens? And I tell them, look, I don't mind you playing the what if game as long as you play it out to the end. If you're going to play the what if game, answer the question and play it out to the end. I mean, I've had people with anxiety neurosis tell me, oh my God, what if I get in front of people and I start having a panic attack? Okay, let's play that, but then play it out. What if you do? Well, I could hyperventilate. Okay, then what if you do? Well, I could pass out and fall on the floor. Okay, all right, then you fall on the floor. Then what if you do that? What happens? And you get to the end and you find out that monsters live in the dark. It's never as bad as anybody thinks. Somebody told me one time, if I play the piano and I pass out and fall over and lay on the floor, worst that could happen is everybody get up and leave and I'd wake up in an empty room. Well, nobody died. You're just in an empty room. Get up and take your ass home. I mean, that's not the end of the world. But people don't critically think anymore. Why is that?
Yeah, you know what? I don't know. I think part of it is people get overwhelmed sometimes with imagining that when they're faced with the decision, imagining that there's just an unending number of options. And I learned at an early age. I didn't really. Part of the reason for writing that book, Company Rules, was because it took me a while to realize after I'd started a business. Started with a dear friend of mine who came out of the British teams, SBS and then MI5. But I realized after a handful of years that the reason why we were able to be successful, or at least keep the business running with a pulse, was because I had absorbed these things from the agency. And one of the things that the agency does is it teaches you pretty quickly that you're not going to get all that information that you want, right? I mean, people watch a Tom Clancy movie or read a book, and usually in those books, they've gathered all this data. Maybe they've got all sorts of optics. They've got ability to look into buildings before somebody rocks up on the target.
Be
whatever
nice,
it is,
wouldn't it?
Yeah, it would be lovely. That would be lovely. But the reality is you're always, unfortunately, dealing with imperfect information. You've got some points. Maybe you don't know the credibility of the source, right? The asset that provided the targeting information, whatever it may be. You just try to get what you can, but operational windows close pretty quickly. Opportunities close pretty quickly. And, if you wait to gather all the available information so that you're comfortable, then, something bad's going to happen. And so the agency teaches you, I refer to it in the book as getting off the X, which, basically is, the X would be an ambush site. You don't want to end up there. But the idea is you need to make decisions, and you need to learn to do that with imperfect intelligence or imperfect information, right? You do what you can, but you gotta eventually unass the sofa and get busy. And the agency teaches that in the operations group very well, I think.
Yeah, you go with what you got. Frankly, I worry more about self-inflicted wounds at this point than I do wounds from the outside. I go on these college campuses and see these kids marching with a banner that says "Gays for Gaza." Seriously? Listen,
Yeah.
who sat
It's
down
like
and thought their way
KFC.
through that?
Yeah, I know. I think part of it is, look, you understand the human nature a lot than I'll ever will. But I think what happens, this is my theory anyway, and it's probably, you can shoot holes in it, but I think that every generation wants it easier for their kids. My parents were fantastic. Like my dad's they're deceased, but my dad was the best man I'll ever know, hands down. And they came out of very tough times. My mom was born 1919. My dad was born 1920. And they wanted a better life for their kids. Right? Now, their parents came out of even more difficult times. They wanted it better for my parents. And it goes on, right? I want a great life for our kids. I think eventually you get to diminishing returns, right? And you create a society or an environment where, no time is spent hunting for food or clean water. And you've got just endless hours to sit around staring at your navel, developing angst over completely useless things. And so I think that may be part of the problem.
Yeah, I've got a story I was looking at today where some parents sued the school because their kid lost a spelling bee. And I'm like,
Yeah.
you got to be shitting me. I really worry about what's going to happen if you have a real problem.
Yeah.
I mean, seriously.
Dr. Phil, my wife, who's the smartest person I know, I completely outkicked my coverage when it came to marrying my wife. But she has a theory that I think is absolutely correct, and that is that the C students run the world. Right? You may want that A student to write some code, but the person running the company will be a C student because they've experienced failure or something near failure, and they get through university, whatever it may be, and they've had to deal with problems, and so that makes them more resilient. It's those parents that coddle their kids and tell them their entire childhood that they're just the greatest and the best, and it's that old adage about everybody gets a trophy. So yeah, I think some failure is definitely a good thing for kids as they're growing up.
My oldest son went to law school, and he always said, A's make professors, and B's make judges, and C's make money.
Well, in that case, my kids are going to make a lot of money then. Yeah. I got that going for us.
I always told my kids, I'd rather you make B's and have friends and a personality and play sports and get along in life than sit back in your room as a noodle neck and make A pluses. And fortunately, they did both, so it worked out okay. You got to have some balance, but we've just lost the ability to hold ourselves to a standard, think critically, and get up and dust ourselves off and go on. So I love the way you've approached this, and I love the book, and you've got a lot of common sense in this, and you're very action-oriented about it, and that's why I love this. And, you know, people listening, I'm telling you, the book is Company Rules. You can get it as an ebook, which means you can get it right now while you're on listening to this. You can get it right now. It's called Company Rules, or Everything I Know About Business I Learned from the CIA. How often do you get somebody that's willing to sit down and share with you not only their training but experiences from such a high-level organization, and somebody that's got the experiences of being on the spot and having to deal with these things. And Mike has done a great job of doing it. He's got a great sense of humor about it. He talks about it in terms and words you can understand. I highly recommend it. I think you will get a tremendous amount out of it.
I will say also, I very much appreciate you mentioning the podcast, the President's Daily Brief. It's been a real pleasure working with the guys at First TV and Red Seat Ventures. It's literally 20 minutes in the morning, 10 minutes in the afternoon. And the idea has always been just talk about the news. Don't tell people how to think about it, right? Tell them what are the critical stories around the globe and let them think about it the way they will. So this is kind of an old school, here's the news, here's what's happened, and Bob's your uncle. And so it's been a real pleasure working with the guys on this.
Well, that's the way you do it. You don't spin it, you just report it. The podcast is the President's Daily Brief with Mike Baker, and you need to subscribe and follow. You can do 20 minutes in the morning and 10 minutes in the afternoon, and you're going to know a hell of a lot more than your neighbors do who are reading the legacy media that are telling them what they want them to think. Mike is going to tell you what happened. He's going to give you the facts and then let you make up your mind whether it's good news or bad news. He's going to give you the facts so you know what happened. The legacy media is going to tell you what they want you to think about what happened. He's going to tell you what actually happened and respect you enough to make up your own mind. It's the President's Daily Brief with Mike Baker. So you need to subscribe and follow and make it part of your morning and then hit it again in the afternoon because stuff happens during the day. It's highly successful, and you'll find out as soon as you click the button, subscribe, and listen.
Very much appreciated, Dr. Phil. Thank you for that. And again, thank you for the opportunity. This has been, I don't know another word to use, but it's just been delightful.
Well, let's do it again, okay?
Absolutely, man.
We talked about one or two things. I've got 8 or 10 on my list just for today, so we'll have to do this again.
Excellent.
All right, we'll talk soon. Thanks so much.
Thank you, sir.
Hey, Dr. Phil here. My network, Merit TV, has it all.
Now, let me blow your mind.
Merit TV's got the news that matters.
The selection of a new pope.
Entertainment you crave.
Busted.
Everybody in a good mood today?
And live events.
Surprise.
What am I, chopped liver?
With serious punch.
Big shot.
Go to merittv.com and download the Merit TV app today.